March 23, 1951, 9 o'clock in the morning. 900 feet above a river valley in Western Korea, in the open door of a transport plane, a paratrooper of the 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team looked down at the ground he was about to fall into. Below him lay a patchwork of frozen rice paddies, a scatter of low brown hills, and a river called the Imjin curling through it like a dropped ribbon. The slipstream tore at his trouser legs. The engines hammered. His static line was hooked to the cable above his head, and his reserve chute pressed against his stomach. Somewhere ahead was a small road town named Munsan-ni, roughly 20 miles northwest of Seoul. His orders were simple to say and almost impossible to guarantee. Fall out of the sky, seize the high ground, and slam a door shut behind a retreating army before it could get away. Minutes earlier, in another aircraft in that same formation, a ranger captain named Warren Allen had gathered his men and asked them to bow their heads for a moment of silence. Then the red light had turned green. What none of these men could see from 900 feet was that the door they were rushing to close had already swung open and emptied. The army they had come to trap was, for the most part, no longer there. Let me pause here for just a moment before we go further. This channel, Cold War Impact, is a small, independent history channel, and the truth is that videos like this one only find new viewers when people decide to help them along. If you value history that is researched carefully and told honestly, the most useful thing you can do costs you nothing. Tap the subscribe button, leave a comment, even if it is only a line or two, and share the video with someone who would appreciate a story like this. Each of those small actions pushes the work in front of new people and lets me keep making these deep dives. Now, back to that morning above the Imjin. Operation Tomahawk, the parachute assault at Munsan-ni, was one of the largest airborne operations the world had seen since the end of the Second World War. It was one of only 2 combat jumps in the entire Korean War. By almost every technical measure, it went beautifully. The weather held, the transports arrived on time, the heavy equipment came down intact. The paratroopers seized every objective they had been assigned. And when the accounting was finished, the operation had captured almost nothing of what it was designed to capture. Because the enemy it was built to destroy had walked north days before the first canopy opened. This is the story of a perfectly aimed blow that landed on empty air. It is also the story of a lesson the United States kept relearning across 3 years of war in Korea, a lesson about the difference between winning a fight and catching an enemy who refuses to give you one. To understand how 3,500 of the best-trained soldiers in the American Army came to jump into a trap with almost nothing in it, we need to go back to the winter that came before, the worst winter of the war, when the ground under the United Nations command simply fell away. In the autumn of 1950, the war had looked all but won. After the landings at Incheon in September, the North Korean army had collapsed, and United Nations forces had chased the survivors north toward the Yalu River and the border with China. Commanders spoke openly of the men being home by Christmas. Then, in late November, the mountains came alive. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers, who had crossed into Korea in secret and waited in the high cold ground without fires or radios to give themselves away, struck the strung-out United Nations columns all at once. The front did not bend. It shattered. Along the Chongchon River, the line broke open. In the northeast, around a frozen body of water called the Chosun Reservoir, American and Allied troops fought a brutal fighting withdrawal through the cold and the ambushes, carrying their wounded and their dead. Temperatures fell to -40 degrees Celsius. Weapons froze. Rations froze. The retreat that followed was the longest in American military history. Then the war took its commander. On December 23, 1950, Lieutenant General Walton Walker, who led the 8th Army, was killed when his jeep collided with a truck on an icy Korean road. 3 days later, on December 26, a new commander stepped off a plane into that atmosphere of exhaustion and defeat. His name was Matthew Ridgway. He was a paratrooper by background, a hard, blunt man who wore a grenade taped to his harness, and he was appalled by what he found. The army he inherited was looking over its shoulder. It had stopped thinking about attacking and started thinking only about how far it might have to run. At the very start of the new year, the Chinese and the rebuilt North Korean forces launched another offensive. They drove south again, and on January 4, 1951, they took Seoul. It was the 3rd time the capital had changed hands in 6 months. To the men on the ground, it must have felt as though the map itself was mocking them, as though every mile paid for in blood would simply be handed back. But Ridgway had seen something in the wreckage that gave him a plan. He understood that the enemy who had beaten him so badly had a weakness built into his greatest strength. The Chinese army moved on foot and carried what it could on its back. It could strike with overwhelming surprise, but it could only strike for about a week before its men ran out of food and ammunition. It had no fleet of trucks, no unchallenged supply lines, no way to sustain a long push. Ridgway decided he would stop trying to hold ground for its own sake and start doing something colder and more deliberate. He would grind the enemy down. He would advance slowly, methodically, backed by artillery and air power, and he would measure success not in towns retaken but in enemy soldiers killed. The strategy even acquired blunt operational names that said exactly what they meant. One offensive was called Thunderbolt. Another was called, without any softening at all, Killer. Ridgway did more than rename the war, though. He rebuilt the army that fought it. He drove out commanders he judged timid, and he pushed the rest to send patrols forward until they had physically regained contact with an enemy they had learned to fear and avoid. He insisted that units tie their positions together so the Chinese could no longer pour through the gaps between them in the dark. He got hot food and winter clothing and mail moving up to men who had been going without. And he made the whole force advance in careful, connected steps, holding lines drawn across the peninsula and given code names, refusing to let any unit race ahead and be cut off the way so many had been in the collapse. Within weeks, the change was visible. The army that had been running in January was, by March, methodically walking north and killing as it went. It was into this transformed Eighth Army, confident again and hungry for a decisive blow, that the idea of a great airborne trap was born. The confidence was not misplaced, and it had been earned in a specific place. In the middle of February, at a crossroads village called Munsan-ni, a single American regiment with a French battalion attached had been surrounded by a much larger Chinese force and ordered to hold rather than pull back. For 3 days and nights they held a tight perimeter, resupplied from the air, throwing back assault after assault in the dark, until an armored column punched through to relieve them. It was the first time in the war that a United Nations force had stood its ground against a full Chinese encirclement and shattered it. The lesson cut both ways. It proved that the Chinese soldier, for all his brilliance at maneuver, could be broken when he was forced to attack dug-in troops backed by massed artillery and air power. And it sharpened the hunger in men like Ridgway to force exactly that kind of fight, to corner the enemy and finish him rather than let him slip away into the hills. Munsan-ni was, in part, an attempt to manufacture another Munsan-ni, only this time with the enemy pinned against an anvil dropped behind his own lines. By the middle of March, the front had firmed into a series of these phase lines, drawn east to west across the country and pushed forward one at a time. The larger design in the western sector, the sector that mattered for our story, was an operation meant to squeeze the enemy out of the ground north of the capital between two rivers, the Han and the Imjin. Into that corridor, the American First Corps was driving hard, with 2 American infantry divisions and a South Korean division pushing north on a broad front. The theory was elegant. Trap whatever enemy forces were withdrawing through the corridor by racing ground troops up behind them while dropping paratroopers across their line of escape in front. It was a hammer and an anvil, the oldest idea in warfare, brought up to date with parachutes and tanks. The airborne piece was the anvil, and it was code-named Tomahawk. Meanwhile, the main advance called Ripper, launched on March 7, was doing its work. Ripper was designed to unhinge the enemy's positions around Seoul and push the front back up toward the 38th parallel, the old border where the war had started. On March 14 and 15, United Nations forces re-entered Seoul for the last time in the war. The capital was a ruin, its population shrunk to a fraction of what it had been, but it was back in friendly hands, and it would stay there. And yet, underneath the good news, the same frustration kept surfacing. The frustration that would define the whole middle stretch of the war, and that would define the Munsan-ni jump most of all. The enemy would not stand and be destroyed. Time and again, United Nations troops would fight their way toward a place expecting a battle, and find that the Chinese and North Koreans had melted away in the night. Supply towns were found stripped and empty. Defensive lines were found abandoned. The men were advancing, but they were punching into fog. Ridgway wanted a decisive result, a battle of annihilation that would break the enemy's ability to fight rather than just push him back a few miles so he could regroup and come again. Here we should give the enemy his due. because the thing that beat Operation Tomahawk was not luck. It was skill. The Chinese and North Korean armies had turned withdrawal into an art form. They marched at night to hide from the aircraft that ruled the daylight sky. They enforced ferocious discipline about noise and light and cover. They could move an entire corps along mountain paths and back roads, while an enemy sat waiting on the main highway. They understood, better than almost any army of the era, that a force you cannot see is a force you cannot bomb, and a force that will not stand still is a force you cannot encircle. For an army with little air power and few vehicles, the ability to disappear was not a weakness. It was a weapon. Every time the United Nations command reached for a knockout blow, that weapon slipped the punch. So Ridgway reached for a tool designed precisely to get behind a running enemy and cut off his escape. He reached for the paratroopers. Airborne forces were, in 1951, still a young and glamorous idea, and a contested one. Their champions saw them as the perfect answer to exactly this problem, a way to leap clear over the front and land squarely across an enemy's line of retreat, doing in a single hour what a grinding ground advance might take days to accomplish. Their skeptics pointed out the obvious dangers. Paratroopers came down lightly armed, without tanks or trucks, scattered across the ground, and utterly dependent on someone reaching them quickly before the enemy could gather himself and crush them. Everything rode on timing and on link-up. Munsan-ni itself was chosen because it sat astride the roads that controlled the Western Corridor and the crossings of the Imjin, a natural cork to jam into the bottleneck through which the North Korean First Corps was thought to be pouring. Seize the town and the heights around it, and in theory, nothing could get north without passing through the paratroopers. It was a sound idea. It depended entirely on the enemy still being south of that cork at the moment it went in. The men of the 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team were among the finest infantry the United States had in Korea, and they carried a history that reached back to the Pacific War. The regiment had been activated in February of 1943 as a glider unit within the 11th Airborne Division, and it had fought hard across Leyte and Luzon in the Philippines. When Japan surrendered, the regiment was among the first American troops to set foot on the Japanese home islands as occupation forces. It was there, the story goes, that the unit earned the name it still carries. Japanese observers, watching these Americans drop from the sky in training, reached for a word to describe them. The word was rakasan. It translates loosely as falling down umbrella men. The paratroopers liked it. They kept it. To this day, the men of the regiment call themselves rakasans, and they mark themselves with the image of a Japanese gateway, a torii. By the time the war in Korea began, the regiment had been reorganized as an airborne combat team, a self-contained striking force with its own artillery, the 674th Airborne Field Artillery Battalion, and its own supporting arms. It had already made history once in this war. On October 20, 1950, north of the North Korean capital of Pyongyang, the 187th had carried out the first combat jump of the Korean War, dropping near two towns called Sukchon and Suncheon. The mission was to land astride the enemy's escape routes and to free American prisoners believed to be moving north. It was also the first time in combat that heavy weapons, including 105mm howitzers and jeeps, had been dropped by parachute alongside the men and gathered up ready to fight. As a feat of airborne technique, it was a triumph. And here a common mistake needs clearing up, because many accounts wrongly hand that first successful combat drop of heavy artillery to Munsan-ni. It belongs to Sukchon and Suncheon 5 months earlier. The human purpose behind that first jump, though, ended in heartbreak, and it sets the emotional key for everything that followed. One of the main reasons for dropping at Sukchon and Suncheon was to get ahead of trainloads of American prisoners being hauled north and to free them before they vanished into captivity. The paratroopers moved fast once they were down, but near a railway tunnel not far from Suncheon, they found what they had been racing to prevent. Guards had taken groups of American prisoners off a train and murdered them rather than let them be liberated. The men who had jumped to save them arrived to bury them instead. It was the cruelest possible proof of a hard rule of this war. Against an enemy who would not wait for you, being good was not enough. You had to be fast, and even then, you were usually too late. The pattern that would define Operation Tomahawk had already shown its face, and almost no one recognized the warning for what it was. Now, in March of 1951, with Ripper driving the enemy back and the enemy still slipping away unbeaten, the paratroopers were the obvious instrument. The plan that took shape sent the ground columns driving up the corridor, while the paratroopers dropped ahead of them at Munsan-ni to seize the road junctions and the high ground and block the enemy's line of retreat. The quarry was the North Korean First Corps, several thousand men who were believed to be retreating through exactly that corridor. Pin them between the paratroopers in front and the armor coming up from behind, and Ridgway would finally get the reckoning he wanted. There had been an earlier version of the airborne plan, aimed at a different town further east near Chuncheon, under the name Hawk. Ridgway killed that one himself. Flying over the area in a small aircraft on March 19 to see the ground for himself, he spotted the lead elements of his own 1st Cavalry Division already rolling into Chuncheon. The enemy there was already gone, and there was nothing left to trap. A small moment, easy to skim past, but it tells you everything about the race that Tomahawk was really running. The front was moving so fast, and the enemy withdrawing so quickly, that an airborne trap planned one day could be pointless the next. The paratroopers were not just fighting the North Korean First Corps, they were fighting the calendar. The objective shifted northwest to Munsan-ni, and the date was set for March 23. Late on the afternoon of March 22, at his headquarters far to the south in Taego, Ridgway made the final decision to go. He made it conditional on 2 promises. His air commander, General Earl Partridge, promised that the weather on the 23rd would allow a drop. His operations officer, Colonel Gilman Mudgett, promised that the ground column could fight its way up to link with the paratroopers within 24 hours. On those 2 assurances, Ridgway ordered the assault for 9 o'clock the next morning. Everything now depended on whether the enemy would still be standing in the trap when it sprang. Consider for a moment the sheer weight of a decision like that. Ridgway was committing thousands of his best men to fall, lightly armed, into ground behind the enemy on the strength of 2 forecasts, one about the weather and one about how fast a column of tanks could clear a road it had not yet driven. If the enemy turned and fought in strength, if the link-up was delayed, if the sky closed in and the resupply planes could not fly, the paratroopers could be surrounded and destroyed far from help. Airborne commanders lived with that arithmetic every time they planned a drop. Ridgway, a paratrooper to the marrow, understood it in his bones, which is very likely why he insisted on flying up to watch the landing with his own eyes, rather than following it by radio from the rear. He was not a man who asked others to run a risk he would not go and stand beside. The mechanics of the drop were staggering to watch. Beginning a little after 7 o'clock that morning, transport planes lifted off from airfields in the Taegu area, climbed, and turned to a rendezvous out over the Yellow Sea before swinging inland toward the drop zones. The transports flew in tight, staggered formations, clusters of planes stacked into a broad V so the paratroopers would land in a concentrated mass rather than strung out for miles across the countryside. There were roughly 140 aircraft in all. About 80 of them were the twin-boom, twin-engine transports the men called the Flying Boxcar, the C-119, and the rest were older twin-engine machines, the C-46 Commando and the C-47, veterans of the Second World War. The whole armada was led by a larger 4-engine aircraft flown by the Air Division commander, Brigadier General John Hennebrey. The 2 workhorse transports told 2 different stories about air power in 1951. The Commando was the oldest of the pair, a big twin-engine plane with a distinctive bulging fuselage that had carried supplies over the Himalayas to China during the Second World War, on the route the crews grimly called the Hump. It could carry around 40 fully loaded paratroopers. The Flying Boxcar was the newer machine, built specifically for the airborne mission, with a fat cargo body slung between twin tail booms and doors at the back that opened the full width of the hold. With those rear doors removed, a boxcar could push out a field gun or a jeep on a heavy platform, the load riding out on rollers and falling away under its own cluster of parachutes. The paratroopers themselves jumped on a canopy about 28 feet across, a static line ripping it open automatically as they cleared the door, with a reserve chute strapped to the chest for the terrible seconds when the main one failed to blossom. Following the regiment's own hard-learned practice, the men jumped with their rifles strapped to their bodies rather than packed away in bundles, so that a trooper could be firing within moments of landing rather than hunting across a field for his weapon. Every detail of the drop had been paid for, somewhere, in the blood of earlier operations. Picture the scale for a moment. It is easy to imagine airborne assault as the vast skies of Normandy or the great carpet of parachutes over Holland in 1944, thousands of aircraft blotting out the sun. Munsan-ni was nothing like that, and deliberately so. It was a single reinforced regiment carried by roughly 140 planes, a sharp, concentrated dagger rather than a sledgehammer. The age of the enormous mass drop was already passing. What the planners wanted here was not shock on a continental scale, but speed and precision. a force set down exactly where it was needed, at exactly the right hour. The bitter irony of Tomahawk is that they achieved the speed and the precision almost perfectly, and the enemy simply declined to be where they aimed. Aboard those planes were about 3,500 paratroopers. Some records put the exact figure at 3,437. They included the 3 infantry battalions of the 187th, the guns of the 674th, and 2 ranger companies, the 2nd and the 4th. There was even a small surgical team from an Indian Army parachute field ambulance jumping in with the assault to treat the wounded. High above all of it, in a gleaming 4-engine aircraft of his own, General Douglas MacArthur circled to watch the operation he had approved. Below him, the machinery of a major airborne assault unfolded across the Korean sky. There is a poignancy to MacArthur's presence overhead that only hindsight supplies. Munsan-ni was among the last operations he would watch as the Supreme Commander in the Far East. Within about 3 weeks, on April 11, 1951, President Truman would relieve him of command, ending one of the most storied and most argued over military careers in American history, and ending it over exactly the questions this kind of war kept raising, about how far to push, how hard to hit, and whether victory in the old and total sense was even possible against an enemy like this one. The general circling above the paratroopers that morning did not yet know that his own war was almost over. That little Indian surgical team captured the strange international character of this war. The men came from an Indian parachute field ambulance, and they jumped alongside the Americans to set up a forward aid post the moment the fighting started. Across their service in Korea, Indian medical personnel treated the wounded of many nations, and on more than one occasion, the wounded of the enemy as well, holding to the idea that a hurt man is a patient before he is a foe. That such a unit was falling out of American aircraft over a Korean rice paddy that morning says a great deal about how many countries this small war had drawn in. Before the transports arrived, fighter bombers, propeller-driven Mustangs, swept over the drop zones and the roads leading to them, bombing and strafing to smother any anti-aircraft fire that might be waiting. A quieter campaign had been running for days as well. Aircraft had scattered leaflets over a wide area, many of them dropped far from the real target on purpose, to confuse the enemy about where the blow would fall. The numbers were enormous. 250,000 leaflets came down over one town on March 19. 750,000 came down over another on March 21. Hundreds of thousands more fell in the days on either side of the drop, and well over 1 million were eventually scattered across the region to the northeast, first to sell the illusion, and then, afterward, to invite the surviving enemy to give himself up. Loudspeaker aircraft with names like The Voice and The Speaker droned over the countryside broadcasting appeals to surrender. It was a modern operation in every sense, combining firepower, deception, and the crackle of the loudspeaker with the brute elemental shock of the airborne age, men falling out of the sky. There were 2 drop zones. One lay to the northeast of Munsan-ni, the other a few miles to the southeast of the town. The plan sent the 3rd Battalion, with the 4th Ranger Company attached, down first onto the northern zone. The 1st Battalion was to come down on the southern zone. The 2nd Battalion with the 2nd Ranger Company and then the artillery would follow. It was neat on paper. It did not survive contact with the air. The ground itself was a paratrooper's worry. This was rice paddy country, just coming out of winter, the fields hard and uneven and cut through with raised dikes and drainage ditches that could snap an ankle on a bad landing. To the northwest, the land rose toward higher hills, so sharply that the jump masters warned their men not to leave the aircraft once the light turned red, because by then the plane would already be banking away to clear the high ground and a late jumper could be flung into the rising slopes. The men would come down low and fast with very little time under the canopy to correct a drift or steer away from a paddy dike. A combat jump is a violent thing even when nothing goes wrong. A man leaves a moving aircraft into a wall of air, is snapped hard by the opening canopy, and then has only seconds to prepare his body before the ground rushes up and hits him. He does all of this loaded down with weapons, ammunition, and gear, sometimes over 100 pounds of it. Then, if he has survived the landing, he must shed his harness, find his weapon, find his unit, and be ready to fight, all in the first confused minutes on hostile ground. That the Rakkasans could do this in the thousands and be organized and moving so quickly is a measure of just how good they were. The trouble began in the 2nd wave of aircraft, the serial carrying the 1st Battalion. The lead plane developed engine trouble almost as soon as it was airborne and had to turn back to change aircraft. The planes behind it, now leaderless, did what pilots under pressure will do. They followed the aircraft in front of them, which belonged to the 1st Serial, and they carried the 1st Battalion to the northern drop zone instead of the southern one. Suddenly, the northern zone, already busy with the 3rd Battalion, was crowded with a 2nd Battalion's worth of parachutes descending on top of it. Only a single plane load, the replacement aircraft carrying the 1st Battalion commander and his small party, arriving late and alone, actually jumped onto the southern zone as planned. Those men floated down, expecting to find their whole battalion around them, and found instead an almost empty field. Ridgway himself was very nearly caught in the confusion. Determined to see the drop with his own eyes, he had landed in a tiny liaison aircraft on the northern drop zone between the waves of transports. He managed to get his little plane back into the air only just in time, climbing out of the way as the misdirected 1st Battalion began raining down onto the very ground he had been standing on. And then, as the paratroopers hit the earth and shed their harnesses and readied their weapons, the strangest part of the whole day revealed itself. Almost nothing happened. There was fire, here and there. Small groups of North Korean soldiers loosed rifle and machine gun fire from the surrounding hills. Mortar rounds fell now and then, but there was no massed enemy, no desperate battle to hold the drop zones. None of the fury an airborne force expects when it lands on top of an army. Instead, the paratroopers found themselves dealing with an almost surreal nuisance. Korean civilians came out onto the drop zone and began hauling away the parachutes, which were made of good silk and nylon and were worth a small fortune in a country stripped bare by war. Shots fired over their heads finally persuaded them to leave the chutes alone. It was not the reception the Rakkasans had braced for. The battalions gathered themselves and pushed out to their objectives. The 2nd Battalion moved to seize the heights northeast of the drop zone. The 1st Battalion, minus 1 company, cleared the town of Munsan-ni itself. The 1 company held back was sent on a rescue mission south because the 1st Battalion Command Group, those men who had jumped alone onto the southern zone, had come under fire from an enemy-held hill and been driven off it. By the middle of the afternoon, those isolated men were brought back in. By late in the day, Brigadier General Frank Bowen, the regiment's commander, could report that his paratroopers had taken every objective assigned to them. Getting there had meant far more than simply jumping. Around the middle of the morning, the heavy drop came in, the field guns of the 674th floating down under great clusters of cargo parachutes, along with jeeps, ammunition, and bundles of supplies. On the ground, the gun crews raced to find their weapons scattered across the paddies, drag the pieces together, assemble them, and lay them ready to fire in support of the infantry. It is one of the least glamorous and most difficult parts of any airborne operation. This frantic gathering up of a force that has been deliberately flung across a mile of open country, and the Rakkasans had drilled it until they could do it fast. By the time the light began to fade, the regiment sat on its objectives in an all-around defensive position, guns registered and perimeter set, waiting through the cold night for a counterattack that the enemy, as it turned out, was in no condition to make. The hardest fight of the day fell to the 4th Ranger Company under Captain Dorsey Anderson, at a piece of high ground overlooking 2 crossing points on the Imjin, a hill known only by its height in meters. The Rangers attacked up the spurs of the ridge into fire coming from the crest and from neighboring hills. They pressed the assault, ran short of ammunition, and were forced to give ground at least once. The hill did not fall that first day. Through the night, American artillery pounded the crest, and the defenders used the noise and the darkness as cover to slip away. The same vanishing act the enemy had performed all across Korea. When Anderson's Rangers stormed the top the next morning, on March 24, they found it abandoned, littered with a handful of enemy dead, some machine guns, and a cache of ammunition left behind. They had won the hill by finding it empty. The 2nd Ranger Company had its own moment in the sun and its own place in history. In the fighting around the drop zone, it took its assigned high ground against North Korean resistance, losing 1 man killed and 2 wounded and taking prisoners along the way. But the significance of what those men did that morning went far beyond one hill. The 2nd Ranger Infantry Company was the only entirely African-American Ranger unit ever to serve in the United States Army. When they jumped at Munsan-ni, they became the first Rangers in the history of the United States Army to make a combat parachute jump. In an army that was still, in those very years, only beginning to dismantle its policy of racial segregation, these men leapt into enemy territory and made history that would go largely unspoken for decades. The story of those men deserves a little more detail, because they very nearly did not get to be there at all. The company had been raised at Fort Benning in Georgia in the autumn of 1950, its ranks filled with volunteers from black airborne units, and its men took to calling themselves the Buffaloes, reaching back to the black cavalry soldiers of the old frontier army. Their commander, Captain Warren Allen, was the officer who had gathered them for that silent prayer in the minutes before the jump. One of his senior sergeants, First Sergeant Lawrence West, was among the first men on the ground and spent the fight roving forward on his own to hunt down enemy machine gun positions. And one of his lieutenants, Albert Cliet, was not even supposed to be on the operation. He had been wounded in earlier fighting and was recovering, riding a hospital train toward the rear, when he heard that his company was about to make a combat jump. He got off the train. In his own words, he grabbed his weapon and his field gear and jumped off that train, because a combat jump was every paratrooper's dream. He made his way back and jumped with his men. That is the kind of unit the 2nd Rangers were, and a small disgrace of history that their country took so long to say their names. While the paratroopers fought for their heels, the other jaw of the trap was trying to close from the south, and it was having a miserable time of it. The ground column was called Task Force Grodin, after its commander, Lieutenant Colonel John Grodin, and it was built around a battalion of medium tanks, with infantry, armoured artillery, engineers, and even 2 British bridge-laying tanks attached. Those British machines, borrowed from a Commonwealth brigade, carried folding spans meant to throw a crossing over any blown bridge or stream the column might meet. One more small sign of how many flags had a hand in this single road march. It passed through the forward South Korean positions shortly after 7 o'clock on the morning of the drop and pushed north up the main road toward Munsan-ni. It met almost no enemy soldiers. What it met instead was mines. The road had been sown with them. The 3rd tank in the column struck a mine within minutes of setting out. From there, the advance became a crawl. Engineers had to lift or blow more than 150 live mines, some of them rigged as booby traps to kill the men who tried to clear them. Mixed in among the real mines were nearly as many fakes, and along one stretch of about 5 miles, the enemy had buried empty ration cans and beer cans in the road simply to make the mine detectors scream and force the exhausted engineers to stop and check every single one. It was a cheap, brilliant, infuriating way to slow an armored column to walking pace, and it worked. The point of the task force did not reach Munsan-ni until 6:30 that evening. The tail of the column did not close up on the paratroopers until 7 o'clock the following morning, roughly a full day after the jump. In fighting its way up that road, the task force lost 4 Patton tanks, along with a pair of jeeps and an armored car to the mines, and 2 more Pattons to enemy artillery. The hammer had reached the anvil, but it had arrived so slowly that any enemy caught between them had been given all the time in the world to leave. And leave he had. That is the heart of this story, and it is where the truth diverges sharply from the clean picture a title might paint. When the paratroopers and their prisoners were counted up, the arithmetic told a deflating tale. The paratroopers' battle losses were light, 19 men killed. The jump itself had injured more of them than the enemy had. 84 hurt in the drop. Though nearly half of those were patched up and back on their feet almost at once, the ordinary toll of throwing thousands of men out of aircraft onto hard, uneven ground. Against that, the enemy had left 136 dead on the field, and 149 had been taken prisoner. Those prisoners gave up the secret of the whole operation under questioning. The enemy who had actually been in the objective area belonged to a single regiment, the 36th of the North Korean 19th Division, and they had numbered somewhere between 300 and 500 men. The rest of the North Korean First Corps, the thousands of soldiers the entire elaborate machine of Operation Tomahawk had been built to encircle and destroy, had withdrawn across the Imjin well before the first American boot left the first aircraft. When a South Korean division later swept the wider area and found no significant enemy at all, the last hope evaporated. The official history of the United States Army recorded the verdict in a single flat word. The bid to block and destroy the North Korean First Corps had been futile. Spare a thought for those few hundred North Koreans who actually were there, because their job had been to die in place so that the rest could get away, and they had very nearly done it. A rearguard exists to buy time, to make a pursuer stop and deploy and fight and burn precious daylight while the main body slips over the horizon. The men of that lone regiment, dug into the hills around the drop zones with their machine guns and mortars, had performed that same bleak duty at Sukchon months before, and they performed it again here. They could not stop an entire American regiment, and they did not try to. They fought, they inflicted what losses they could, and in the darkness they pulled back across the river to fight another day, leaving behind their dead and a scattering of prisoners for the interrogators. In its own grim way, it was a small masterclass in how the entire communist withdrawal worked. Sacrifice a little to save a great deal, and never ever be caught in the open where the enemy most wants you. The deeper problem was one of knowledge, of intelligence, and it is a problem that haunts every attempt to trap a moving enemy. The planners had built the operation around where they believed the North Korean First Corps to be, and by the time the paratroopers landed, that belief was simply out of date. The enemy had read the pressure of Ripper correctly and pulled back on his own schedule, not on the one the plan assumed. Worse, as the days passed, Ridgway's intelligence staff began to identify a fresh and powerful Chinese army group gathering off to the flank, forces that had not figured in the calculations at all. That discovery would soon persuade Ridgway to rein in his advance beyond the Imjin rather than push deeper into ground where a new blow might be building. In other words, the trap at Munsan-ni had been set for an enemy who was no longer in it, in a landscape that was quietly filling up with a different enemy no one had fully accounted for. It is a sobering picture of how hard this kind of war was to see clearly, even from the cockpit of a reconnaissance plane with the whole valley spread out below. There is a small, almost cinematic footnote to the day. On the flight home, one of the flying boxcars, possibly hit by ground fire, caught fire in the air. The crew bailed out over the Korean countryside. It was the loudspeaker plane called The Voice, the one that had spent the morning broadcasting surrender appeals, that spotted the downed airmen, and it guided a helicopter in to pull them out. The propaganda aircraft ended the day as a rescue aircraft, which is as fitting an image as any for an operation where nothing quite went to script. For all the disappointment on the ground, the operation showcased one thing the United States could do that its enemy could not even imagine. It could supply an entire force from the air, on demand, day after day. In the days that followed the jump, from March 24 to March 27, cargo planes flew more than 50 resupply missions to the airborne troops, dropping over 260 tons of ammunition, food, and fuel to keep the regiment fighting. The contrast could hardly have been sharper. The enemy the Rakassans were chasing had escaped precisely because he had learned to live on almost nothing and to move faster than any supply line could follow. The Americans, by contrast, could rain hundreds of tons of supplies onto a hilltop with the turn of a radio dial. Both facts were true at the same time, and both help explain why this war would end not in victory for either side, but in a long, grinding deadlock. The paratroopers were not finished fighting, even if the Great Trap had failed. In the days after the drop, they were turned east, placed under a corps headquarters, and thrown into an effort to catch Chinese forces that were delaying the advance of another American division. Here, at last, they met the Chinese in strength, and here the weather turned savage. Heavy rain moved in and soaked everything. On the high ground, the paratroopers found their rifles and automatic weapons jamming, the mechanisms fouled with mud and water, and in some places the fighting came down to bayonets and hand grenades because that was all that would still work. In these grim, rain-lashed actions, the regiment did real damage to the enemy. In one day of fighting near a single contested hill on March 28th, the paratroopers reported killing more than 200 Chinese soldiers. It was harder, bloodier, and in raw numbers more destructive to the enemy than the celebrated drop that had preceded it, and almost no one remembers it because it did not come with parachutes and photographers. It was in this period, on March 25th, that 2 soldiers of the regiment earned the nation's second highest award for valor, the Distinguished Service Cross. Master Sergeant Irvin Muldoon and Private First Class Eugene Estep, both of the 2nd Battalion, manned machine guns against a massed Chinese counterattack and broke it. Both men were killed doing it. Their crosses were awarded after their deaths. They are the kind of names that do not make it into the headline about an operation, the kind that live afterward mostly in the citations and the memories of the men who were there, and they deserve to be spoken aloud. Among the officers who jumped at Munsan-ni was a man whose name would, many years later, become far more famous for a different war entirely. Major Ronald Spares had commanded a company of paratroopers in Europe in the Second World War, and here he was again, jumping into combat in Korea, one of the very small number of Americans to make combat jumps in both wars. His story would eventually reach millions of people through a television series about his old wartime unit. But on that morning in March of 1951, he was simply another paratrooper, doing a hard job well, and his part of the operation secured its stretch of the objective and cleared the enemy from it. So, what do we make of Operation Tomahawk? It is tempting to file it away as a failure, and in the narrow sense of its own stated goal, it was one. It did not trap the North Korean First Corps, It did not deliver Ridgway the battle of annihilation he wanted. The great scything blow came down on a rearguard of a few hundred men and a field full of civilians carrying off parachutes. Judged against the dream, it fell short, and honest history has to say so plainly. But that is not the whole measure of it, and the fuller reckoning is more interesting than either triumph or disaster. As a demonstration of skill, the operation was close to flawless. 3,500 men and their guns were delivered onto their drop zones in the right country at the right hour and were fighting as organized units within the hour. Every objective was taken. The losses were remarkably light for so complex an undertaking. The problem was never the execution. The problem was the target. The paratroopers had done everything right and still caught almost nothing, because the enemy they hunted had mastered the one thing that made all their skill beside the point. He had refused to be there. That was the real lesson of Munsan-ni, and it was a lesson about the limits of even the most spectacular tactics against an opponent who will not oblige you by standing still. An airborne encirclement is a magnificent thing, but it only works if there is an army underneath it to encircle. Twice now, at Sukchon in the autumn and at Munsan-ni in the spring, the Rakkasans had executed the maneuver perfectly, and twice the enemy had already gone. The United Nations command would keep running into this wall for the rest of the war. You cannot trap a shadow, and the Chinese and North Korean armies had made themselves very good at being shadows. The men who led and made this operation deserve to be remembered for who they actually were, not for a legend. Frank Bowen, the general who commanded the regiment, was a career soldier of real distinction. Born on an army post in the Philippines at the start of the century and commissioned from West Point in 1926, he had already earned the Distinguished Service Cross fighting the Japanese in New Guinea in the earlier war. He led the Rakkasans on both of their Korean combat jumps, and his conduct at Sukchon, personally shepherding thousands of paratroopers into action behind enemy lines, earned him the citation for a second such cross. After Korea, he went on to command the storied 101st Airborne Division before retiring as a Major General. He was the kind of officer whose competence rarely makes for dramatic storytelling, precisely because things did not tend to go wrong around him. The all-African American Rangers of the 2nd Company have a harder and more important legacy. Their unit was disbanded not long afterward, as the small ranger companies of that period were broken up and their men scattered to other units, and for a long time their achievement went almost entirely unrecognized in the popular memory of the war. It took decades and the patient work of veterans and historians for the story of the first Rangers to jump into combat, black soldiers in a still segregating army, to receive anything like its due. When you hear the number 3,500 paratroopers, remember that a small and remarkable slice of them made a kind of history that had nothing to do with the trap that failed to close, and everything to do with who was allowed to serve and how. The regiment as a whole paid a heavy price across its time in Korea. It suffered more than 2,000 casualties, including more than 400 men killed in action, and 3 of its soldiers earned the highest award the nation can give, the Medal of Honor. Their names were Corporal Lester Hammond, Corporal Rodolfo Hernandez, and Private First Class Richard Wilson, and 2 of the 3 received the honor after their deaths, having given their lives in the kind of close, desperate fighting that this war produced again and again on nameless hills. They belong in this story alongside the more famous drop, because the true history of a regiment is written far more in fights like theirs than in any single spectacular morning. As for the regiment itself, Munsan-ni was the end of an era. The Rakkasans never made another combat jump. After the operation, they were pulled back into reserve and used again and again as a kind of fire brigade, rushed to wherever the line was in danger. In the summer of 1952, they drew one of the strangest assignments of the entire war, sent not to the front, but to a prison island called Kojedo, where communist prisoners had seized control of their own compounds and had even taken the American camp commandant captive. The paratroopers went in and restored order among tens of thousands of defiant prisoners, a reminder that this war was fought in many forms, not all of them on a hilltop. And airborne assault on the grand scale, whole regiments dropped behind an enemy, was already becoming a thing of the past, overtaken by the helicopter and by the hard truth that mass parachute drops were enormously expensive and enormously vulnerable, and that they only paid off against an enemy who would stay put long enough to be surrounded. Munsan-ni stands as one of the last of its kind, a closing note on a chapter of warfare that had opened over the fields of Normandy. The larger war moved on quickly and left the Munsan-ni gamble behind. Within a month, on April 22, 1951, the Chinese launched an enormous spring offensive, throwing something on the order of 700,000 men at the United Nations line in a bid to win the war outright. It was stopped at fearful cost in battles whose names became legends of their own, along the Imjin River and at a valley called Kapyong, where badly outnumbered defenders held against wave after wave. When that offensive spent itself and the United Nations forces counterattacked, the front settled at last into the rough vicinity of the 38th parallel, near where the whole war had begun. There it would grind on for 2 more years, a static and bloody deadlock of trenches and hills known only by numbers, until the armistice of 1953 froze the 2 Koreas along a line that has scarcely moved since. The regiment that jumped at Munsan-ni is still with us. Today its lineage lives on in battalions of the 101st Airborne Division at Fort Campbell in Kentucky, whose soldiers still call themselves Rakkasans, and who have carried the name into Vietnam, into the Gulf, into Iraq, and into Afghanistan. And the country they jumped into remains divided along that same tense line, watched over now by different weapons and different soldiers, but shaped in part by choices made in that desperate spring of 1951, when commanders tried everything they could think of to force a decision, and could not. Which brings us back to that paratrooper in the door, high above the Imjin, staring down at the ground, rushing up to meet him on the morning of March 23. He and the men beside him were about to perform a feat of arms that soldiers train their whole careers for, and most never get to attempt. They would do it well. They would seize their hills, take their prisoners, hold their ground, and lose remarkably few of their own. And they would discover, once they were down among the empty paddies and the fleeing civilians, that the great enemy army they had come to catch had quietly walked away days before, north across the river, out of the closing jaws, gone. And there lies the paradox. The blow was perfect. The aim was true. The men were as brave and as skilled as any army could ask for. And it very nearly did not matter at all, because the whole thing had been aimed at a place the enemy had already chosen to leave. Munsan-ni was not a story of a weapon that failed. It was a story of a war that would not hold still long enough to be won by a single stroke, no matter how brilliant that stroke might be. 3,500 men fell out of a clear Korean sky to slam a door, and when the dust settled and the guns cooled, they turned around to find that the room behind the door was empty, and that the war, as it so often did in those years, had already slipped past them and moved on ahead.